Vamos começar esta nova sessão, realmente, que irá sobretudo falar da problemática da globalização enfim, e dos desenvolvimentos que têm havido ultimamente sobre esta matéria. Nós contamos aqui com um conjunto de especialistas de grande qualidade e, portanto, para mim é até um grande prazer intervir neste debate com especialistas de tão grande qualidade. Mas, antes de mais, eu queria prestar homenagem ao embaixador Sousa da Costa pela realização deste grande evento, que está a decorrer da melhor forma que enfim, possível, e também queria aproveitar para prestar homenagem ao Dr. Luís Amado, que não está aqui presente, que é o presidente do Clube de Lisboa, e ao professor Fernando Cardoso, que está aqui na primeira fila, que é um bom amigo e que teve um papel particularmente relevante na organização deste evento. E falando agora dos nossos convidados, eu tomaria a liberdade de fazer a apresentação destes nossos convidados, mas se não levarem a mal, farei a apresentação em inglês. So, we have here with us three specialists, very good specialists, Montek Ahluwalia, he's on my left side, and he was Vice President of the India Planning Commission. He obtained graduation at Oxford University and was entitled to a Rhodes Scholarship. He worked in the World Bank, and since 1979 he has had an important role in different positions, very different positions in India public administration. Well, thank you very much for being here with us, for your presence. I'm sure that you are going to make a very interesting conference. We also have here Daniel Hamilton in the extreme left, without any kind of political connotation. He's founding director of the Center for Transatlantic Relations in Washington. For 15 years, he was executive director of the American Consortium for European Union Studies, and he's presently director of the Atlantic Basin Initiative. And finally, the last but not the least, of course, Raquel Pinto. He's researcher of the Portuguese Institute of International Relations, and she was president of the Portugal Association of Political Science between 2012 and 2016, and she is nowadays professor of Asiatic Studies at the New University of Lisbon. Temos, portanto, aqui um conjunto muito interessante de especialistas e eu iria passar de imediato a palavra ao primeiro conferencista, uma vez que estamos todos ansiosos por ouvir as suas intervenções e temos aqui realmente um calendário para cumprir, temos timings já estabelecidos e, portanto, vou pedir aqui ao nosso convidado Montek Ahluwalia para fazer a sua conferência. Mr. Ahluwalia, it's a great pleasure to have you among us, and you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much. Let me first of all say how very pleased I am to be here. A delightful city, and it's my first visit to Lisbon, and it's been great. And nice to be in the conference too. You know, this session is supposed to address three questions. So just to kind of remind the audience, I want to just mention those three questions and then try and say a few things that will respond to them. And question number one, are we entering a new age of protectionism, you know, sort of hello protectionism, goodbye globalization? That's one question. Second question is this being caused by crony capitalism, which is in some sense wiping out the operations of free markets, the presumption being that free markets would be a good thing, and it's the cronies that have mucked it up. That's the second question. And the third one is, how will China and India react to all this? Now, this is the first time that actually the developing countries come into the discussion. China has, of course, been mentioned earlier, so I'll take some time on that. But, you know, before addressing these questions, I want to hark back to that brilliant presentation that George Friedman had this morning, because the answers to these questions depend very much on whether he's right or there is another explanation of what's happening which is right. Now, his view, clearly, is that the underlying momentum of the global economy has reached a major breaking point. And then, you know, there will be traumas. He's not saying that we'll be lost forever, but maybe in 10 years. I mean, this model, as he called it, has run out of steam, and it's going to take 10 years for it to get reset. It will get reset, but sort of sit back and enjoy the ride. That was his message. You know, the other understanding is the more conventional one, which says that there's been some unbalancing, and as a result, there's imbalance in policies. And if only all the countries were to realize their own self-interest and make some changes which are not so horrendous, then everything will be set right and we'll be back to the world of prosperity. This is what the IMF and to some extent the World Economic Forum regularly put out. That they don't deny there's a problem, but they don't believe that this is a fundamental problem. So I think you have to keep this in mind when you look at the answers that we put forward. I think there's more truth perhaps than people recognize with the fact that there are some fundamental changes, but I don't entirely agree with what George said about the nature of those changes. So let me, with that background, I think you gave me 10 minutes, right?
Give me a little more, 1 minute
okay.
more.
All right, first, are we entering a new phase? Let's be clear, things are different, and certainly all of a sudden, governments are speaking things that they didn't speak earlier. So it is different. But you know, I think it's very important that we recognize that it's not just because, let's say, the US president today is far more outspoken on these things than his predecessors were. But the anti-trade movement predates President Trump. I mean, in a sense, you might say the Doha round was neatly buried in November or December of 2015. And not just by the US administration, by many of the developed countries. So the basic fact that we've run up into a difficulty on trade is not to be attributed to anything that happened in the course of the last year. There were problems building up, and we need to keep that in mind. I mean, how can we get out of that, and will we get out of it? This is important. Now, I tend to believe that we are not, since I don't believe that we are in a fundamental 10-year disruption, I think we will get out of it, but it's not going to be very easy. I'm inclined to think that we will not see progress. So anyone who's hoping for a quick return to progress in trade liberalization is going to be disappointed, but there may be less rolling back than looks at the moment. Now, this is something yet to be sorted out. A lot of it depends on the tactics that different groups adopt. Certainly the US administration is the first one to fire the shots. Let's see what China does, let's see what Europe does. And you know, in all these things, as people see the costs of what they do, they're usually nimble enough to change their position slightly. So I think that the assumption that trade liberalization would proceed easily is not valid, but there is a chance that we may be able to stop a major reversal. That's my answer to it. Second question, is all this the result of cronyism? Now, you know, cronyism really means the use of politically well-connected people to extract policies that politically benefit them. And I think while there's no doubt that there's some cronyism, what you're seeing is not just the result of cronyism. I think it's the result of underlying factors, some of which probably reflect social weaknesses, and others reflect the way the economy works. Now, if you believe, for example, Thomas Piketty, he's not saying that the problems arise because of cronyism. He's saying there's something fundamental in the workings of a liberal market economy that is going to lead to an increasing concentration of power and inequality. I think at this point I want to mention that, you know, there is a lot of work done on whether globalization and democracy can actually survive together. And the assumption is they can if the system is run in a way which ensures a broad base of prosperity. I think Mary Caldo earlier today made this point, implied this point, that in the post-war European expansion, a very important reason why rapid growth took place and was accepted was that the sort of social security network which would support that had been laid. And that's certainly true in most of Europe. Not true in the United States, but it's true in Europe. So I think the question really is that if there are inherent disequalizing tendencies, which, I mean, one view would be it's inherent in the liberal neoclassical model. Another view also is that globalization sort of encourages a winner-takes-all approach, which leads to a huge concentration of incomes. I mean, we were just discussing earlier that, you know, the second best football player in the world is probably not that much worse than Ronaldo. Now, I know I'm treading on dangerous ground because he's a Portuguese star, but I think even a nationalist Portuguese would accept that there must be a second best football player, and he may not be that much worse. But I don't see a single T-shirt anywhere else other than a red T-shirt with a number 7. So that really shows that winner takes all is a real phenomenon, and that creates some inequality. I think what it means is that we have to recognize that, and the system has to be run in a way in which most people feel there's something in it for them. And if for whatever reason, whether due to bad policy or due to a crisis or some temporary falling down on something, if the system begins to work in a way where the majority or a large number of people feel that it doesn't deliver anything to them, then you can expect a pushback. And that pushback will either damage democracy or lead to protectionism or both. So this is important, that if we want the assumption of a well-functioning market economy, which has a lot of pro-efficiency factors to it, we better make sure that the social outcomes that it generates are acceptable. So I'll leave it at that, but I think that's something we need to think of it broadly rather than just narrowly in terms of cronyism. Now, in my remaining minutes, which I don't know how many there are, I'm turning to the other question, which I was very interested in, because it says China and other developing countries. Clearly, China is the most spectacular example of a successful developing country, which since about the mid-80s or late 80s has seen about 30 years or so of a growth rate of 10% plus. In more recent years, other developing countries have also been doing that. So it's not just China, it's actually China and many other emerging market countries. And the structure of the world economy has changed so that the share of GDP, which is accounted for by these countries, is now close to 50%. And in another 10 years, it will be more than 50%. Now, this is very relevant when you ask the question, what should China and India and other developing countries do? You know, if the underlying global model that you have in mind, or we have in mind, is that these countries only piggyback on the success of industrialized countries, then you come to the problem that Professor Friedman raised, that if that underlying model is broke, then everybody's had it, because nobody can run a model which is dependent on huge amounts of consumption fed by debt in the United States and to some extent in Europe. But you know, if you believe that there are other models, you have a developing world which, to my mind, is quite capable of growing autonomously at a reasonable rate because its own supply factors have improved. Now, what are these supply factors? You know, economists, when they look at what determines growth, so look at things like human capital, physical capital, access to technology, some basic institutions that are capable of bringing about efficiency, particularly the financial sector, but also regulatory system, etc. Now, the proposition I put forward is that in all these dimensions, the developing countries have actually made remarkable progress. And what you're seeing as high growth and less people living below the poverty line is a reflection of this success. And if you think about it, if 55% of world GDP, is there, there's no reason why they can't autonomously continue to grow and not be dependent on growth in terms of demand from other countries. What can break this system is really the pressure that this would put on the limited resources of the planet. Now, that's a very serious problem, and if you ask me, that's the biggest global failing right now. Because there's no way that GDP can grow without energy growing, and most of the energy today comes from fossil fuels. Yes, we are hoping that there'll be lots of technology, there'll be greener fuels, etc., etc. But from everything I know, the present path that the world is on, post the Paris Agreement, and irrespective of President Trump's withdrawal from the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement was a very, very inadequate response. It was wonderful because for the first time, the whole world got around and said, we agree there's a problem, and we agree we're going to do something about it. But while we were so busy celebrating that, we didn't make it plain that what they've agreed to do is about 1/3 of what needs to be done. And the withdrawal of the United States will make that 1/3 a little bit less. So the real question is, what are we going to do in the light of this in terms of global governance to find some solution? And there, quite frankly, there isn't much progress. And I think one of the difficulties really is that if you're going to have an agreement on global governance, there has to be a shared understanding of how to moderate your own actions. Now, clearly, people will come to a shared understanding if there's an agreement on what is a sharing of the burden. Now, the good news is that the developing countries are no longer saying that we don't have to do anything, which they were saying for a very long time. But from the point where they've agreed that we have to do something, to move it to a system where what we all agree upon makes some sense is a very, very big change. If we don't get any progress in that, unlike on trade, etc., where I think that, by and large, there won't be too much damage. If we don't get any progress on that, we have a really bad outcome. Because the developing countries, all countries are supposed to start negotiations for the mid-2050 strategy, which would be around 2020, which means they must be starting now. And the present position is that every country, including all the industrialized countries and all the developing countries, would have to agree to a very substantial reduction in the emissions projections that they currently have built into their targets. And frankly, if you want to be negative, I wouldn't be negative about trade, I wouldn't be negative about GDP growth, I wouldn't really be negative about the global financial system. This is the thing to be really negative about, because I just don't see any good news there at all. So I think with those words, I've probably exhausted the time you gave me. I'm happy to carry on. We'll do that in the questions. Thank you.
You have exhausted the world resources, and also the time. Now we are going to have Daniel Hamilton. You have the floor, my dear friend.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to the organizers again for having us all here. We all, I think, are sharing a great day in Lisbon with you. So, as was said, we had some questions that we were asked to address. I think the basic question, it seems to me, was, is globalization continuing? What's the backlash? How should we think about it? I think my quick answer is it's continuing and, in fact, accelerating in some areas And there is already certainly a backlash and a great questioning of its effects in many other areas. And I will think of globalization in a much broader sense than trade. And I think we get hung up, in fact, when what do we mean by this, globalization? I think there are different narratives out there that become problematic. They're almost myths or prevailing narratives that don't really help us. Let me just try to briefly talk about three of those before getting to what we have to deal with. I think one sort of prevailing narrative that sort of the apostles of globalization will tell us is that it's global. It's seamless. Distance doesn't matter anymore. It's the death of distance. You will see books on that. Well, the reality is actually it really does matter, that globalization is very uneven in its effects, and that it can be thick or it can be thin, depending on what the connections are that we're talking about. And that's where politics comes in. The unevenness of globalization means a lot of different things to different people and to different societies. So I think this notion that the death of distance is what we're talking about just is not true, and it's not helpful, and we should not start with that point. I think the second narrative that I hear often, it's not quite the same, but they almost are talked about in the same way, is, and I've heard it today, sort of the rise of what some call the multipolar world. I think we have to pause a minute when we think of what does that term actually mean. It seems to imply different centers of power, not sort of one. I think it's a reaction to what was called the unipolar moment after the end of the Cold War. And that there seems sort of a secondary insinuation that somehow these poles are also similar or almost equal. And many point to, the United States, Europe, India, China, Brazil, Russia. Sort of that's the multipolar world. Well, it just deserves a second of reflection. You have to sort of say, really? I mean, first of all, that's a very state-centric view of the world we're in, whereas globalization is much more than that. So you have to wonder whether the state-centric view these days really even helps us with the phenomenon of globalization or not. The second is multipolar centers of power. So it seems to me you want to think about power. And again, if you think about those countries that I was just talking about, all the dimensions of power, from soft power, hard power. Some people are talking about sharp power now when they talk about China. Which countries really have this full spectrum of power resources and the capability not only to have them, but to deploy them in a very agile way and combine them? I think you end up only with a couple, frankly. So I don't think multipolar gets us too far. I think what is a better way of thinking about it is the diffusion of power is what we're seeing today. We're seeing, in fact, a diffusion of power away from the state-centric world. And that's the model that globalization is challenging us with. You see power leaking away from states to non-state actors. You see power leaking among states, between different kinds of states. And especially relevant for Europe, you see power leaking above the state to sort of something like the European Union, which has qualities that individual member states, like on trade, no longer have real competence for. So I think we have to think harder about the diffusion of power and how it relates to globalization. And back to this point about thick and thin connections. If you have to go with the polar term, I would say interpolar is better because it brings in the interdependencies between those centers of power. And the third narrative that I often hear about, and again, it's not stated maybe explicitly, but it seems to be the prevailing narrative, certainly in the media, is that globalization is all about the rise of Asia. Well, and there was a famous book maybe 10 years ago, Kishore Mahbubani wrote about the Asian hemisphere. And everyone's really caught up in this dynamic. Of course, China will change the world. India is changing the world. But by definition, globalization is not about one part of the world. And by definition, if there's an Asian hemisphere, there must be actually an Atlantic hemisphere. And I think if you open up that term, then you see some interesting connections. Tom Friedman's a columnist for the New York Times. He wrote a book a long time ago when he had a very simple definition of globalization. It's simply how continents connect. How are continents connecting? And if you look at how continents are really connecting in all sorts of flows, people, goods, services, investment, trade, you name it, technology, data, disease, you see that the Atlantic hemisphere is also connecting in many, many ways that seem to be escaping a lot of attention. And I think it's particularly relevant for Portugal. Back to the question earlier today, what does this mean for Portugal? Let me just give you 3 brief examples. Energy was mentioned. The Atlantic Basin is becoming the world's energy reservoir over the next few decades because of all the tremendously diverse kinds of revolutionary developments that are happening all along both the south and the northern part of the basin. It's not about only the United States fracking and the U.S. energy revolution. If you go all through into the Caribbean basin, if you go down through to Brazil, all along the eastern coast of South America, all sorts of things happening there, back up to West Africa, all along there. Also renewables, the center of the renewables innovation, global innovation industry is in the Atlantic, and it's particularly in Europe. The idea that you could break the connection between the production of wealth and the consumption of resources, which would be truly revolutionary, has its potential because of innovation happening here. And 80% of the biofuels in the world come from the Atlantic. And so, as I think George was saying earlier today, the U.S. is shifting away. The Persian Gulf becomes less of an important energy source for the United States, becomes much more important for Asia. Asia doesn't have those energy resources. The Atlantic does, and on the margin, the Atlantic will start to produce energy for the rise of Asia. The second is commerce. We talk about the rise of these big economies, but there's still more commerce flowing in the Atlantic basin than in any other basin. It's just the case. If you put trade and investment, all these other kinds of flows together, it's simply still the fulcrum of the global economy. But it's a hemisphere of great wealth and inequality. And that all that commerce doesn't flow evenly again. That's where the politics that come back in. But if you think about it, where's the greatest center of German investment in the world? Sao Paulo, Brazil. U.S. companies in the UK export more to the rest of Europe than U.S. companies based in China export to the entire world. U.S. assets in Poland, Hungary, and Czech Republic, not really big are double or greater than all U.S. assets in India. So we're progressing with globalization, but it's not an even process. And of course, we're starting from a very different point. And the last on the Atlantic, and I would say part of the rise of the Atlantic is because of the rise of the Pacific. You had to expand the Panama Canal. You're building all these deep tanker ports all across the Atlantic basin. The Arctic is opening up. This will become an interaction between the Asian and the Atlantic hemispheres in a sort of a hemispheric globalization when it comes to commerce. So it's not an either-or issue. The last point is about the negative side of this, what I would call the dark networks of the Atlantic basin, which are also about globalization. Back to crony capitalism or whatever you want to call it. You have drugs being produced in South America coming now over not just to North America and to Europe, but to Africa, into the Sahel, into a big, big region of Africa that is basically run by gangs and lawless areas. It's fueled by gun purchases that come down from North America, and the ultimate customers are in Europe. So you have now created a circular set of dark networks here that are preying on people and are fueled by the resources that come from that circular network. That means everybody in the Atlantic basin is implicated. And yet we have no institutions to deal with that. So my plea here is to think about how we are connected by different flows, and that's more what globalization is about. So 3 implications for today, it seems, just to conclude. I think we have 2 worlds coexisting at the moment. We have the state-centric world, which we're used to, and then we have this world of networks. The state-centric world is about sovereignty, it's about borders, it's about institutions, organizations. The network-centric, the flow-centric world is about webs and hubs and data. It's about value chains. They coexist uneasily, and that's the world we're facing right now when it comes to the political consequences of this. The value chain map of Europe is not the same as the institutional map of Europe. Companies don't stop at the border of the European Union when they're figuring out their value chains. And we have to, as George said earlier today, there's a tendency in EU Europe to call itself Europe. But increasingly, non-EU Europe is becoming more important to the rest of the world. And we have to think about these flows and how they're happening both in positive and negative ways. It also highlights the really important issue of the digital economy. The digital economy is becoming much of the economy. Either it's what's fueling tangible things, or it is the value behind many intangible things. And we have to think about hard, because there's no good data about data. Governments do not know how to really measure this digital economy very well. So we're not capturing it. It's not a distinct part of the economy where you can just put it over here. It's becoming the economy. If you hit a button of an architectural design and send it across the ocean, that's high value. That was a high value click, probably. How do you measure it? There are things like that that we're not doing well on. And if you think about, and we're so preoccupied with our current challenges of the digitization age, I call it, the platform companies and what are we doing? I think we have to think harder about what's coming at us very soon. In fact, it's already starting. The digital economy is our current preoccupation. But the other revolutionary science with amazing speed right now is biology. And if you put those two together, digital revolution and a biological revolution, we are heading toward what I would call a biocognitive age, in which the next trillion-dollar industries are not built on codes of 1 and 0, they're built on our genetic code. That raises all sorts of issues. And because it's uneven, it's unclear who's going to capture that market and what all the implications of that will be. And you can already see companies in this space. You see amazing innovations happening in the biological space. They're going to be turned into profit-making companies. Who's capturing that revolution? We haven't even grappled with the one we're in now. And so the last piece on the implication for today, back to the sort of the darker side of this, is that our connections are what keep us going these days. So governments that are accustomed to protecting their territories when you come to traditional security have to think really harder about protecting their connectedness. It's a different kind of security challenge, but it's no less important. The migration challenge to Europe over the last few years was a flow security challenge, in which traditional territorial security approaches aren't going to work. You have to think about flow security. What is the commonality behind terrorists, little green men, energy cartels, cyber hackers? They are all networks that are trying to prey on the networks of free societies and disrupt the critical functions of those societies for whatever purpose they may have. Traditional security approaches don't deal well with that. We have to think about a flow security approach, and that's why globalization is not just about economics. It has so many other dimensions to it. So just to conclude, I think as you just said, in the end, the political question is globalization working for you? That seems to me to be the question. How every individual answers that question determines the politics of this. And you see a new setting for trade in which many people are saying, actually, no. And so this trading system is in some crisis. They are wondering about losing jobs. and we haven't done a good job of explaining, how the churn of the economy works, it seems to me. But we're certainly not in a business as usual mode. The new normal, the normal we're dealing with, is no business as usual. You see that in the United States, but I think as George said earlier today, you see that also in Europe, for instance, in which the traditional party affiliations and structures have fragmented. On the right, you now have real divisions between sort of traditional mainstream free market conservatives and sovereigntists. And they don't agree with each other. That's just within the right. And on the left, you have many who say we should maintain high standards so that we can set the standards to the globe, and environments, safety, food, all of that. And you have others on the left that said, what about my job? You're pricing us out of the market. I'm going to lose my job if you do that. They don't agree. So we're fracturing, and the real division seems to be more those who are still arguing for the benefits of an open society, and those who are arguing we have to maybe shield and protect. Mr. Macron's image for Europe is a Europe that protects. That's not an outward-looking message. Everyone's celebrating him as a great visionary for Europe, but this is a message of Europe looking inward, shoring down, hunkering down, protecting itself. It's not about reaching out. And those are the divides I think we are dealing with, both in Europe and the United States, and I believe probably in many other countries. That is really kind of the political divisions that are challenging our old frameworks. So I would say what George said earlier today, let's enjoy the ride.
Bem, o mais rapidamente e eficientemente possível, vou passar a palavra à professora Raquel Vaz Pinto, cuja apresentação já fiz. E, portanto, a senhora professora tem desde já a palavra.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank both the wonderful speakers to my left. And being a discussant in this panel, my job has been made much easier because the points were very well presented. I would first like to take the liberty to address you by your first name, if that's okay. And secondly, to say that, being a discussant is always the nice word for saying the devil's advocate. So here I go. Montek, you talked about all these economic concerns, all these questions relating to to countries such as India, China, and so forth. One of the usual comparisons that is made between China and India is that China's development, China's economic growth has been, at least in the first instance, led by the state, whilst India, or most of the economic growth in India, has been led by the private sector. My first question to you would be, would you agree with this broad characterization of India's development? And the second narrative usually is that although the economic growth of India has been slower to China, China is of course the spectacular case, there is a good argument to be made that it is perhaps more sustainable, not only in environmental terms, but also in terms of policy. And I was wondering if you would also agree with that view. And thirdly, while I was listening to your presentation, and I was thinking about the linkage between being a democracy and, in your case, being the largest democracy in the globe. In the globe, whenever my students talk about the complexity of elections, I always bring the case to them of the state of Uttar Pradesh that has 200 million people. And when they have elections, you have to organize elections for 100 million people. And that is real complexity at work. So that is always my case study for them. The linkage between liberal democracy and economic growth. You talked about prosperity. What I find fascinating about India, amongst other things, is that we have a liberal democracy, or since the end of the 40s, with the constitution in 1950. Yes, you did have the 2 years in which the constitution was suspended by Indira Gandhi and so forth, but it is a democracy that has been able to deal with the fact that it was not very prosperous in the first decades, if I can put this mildly. What would be your advices to the current issues pertaining liberal democracy and the resilience of those liberal democracies in cases in which prosperity is not what it used to be, at least for some sectors of society? So as you can see, they are all very small questions and very easy to answer. For Dan, well, Dan... No, I am not done. Soft questions. For Dan, while I was listening to you, as you were talking about this really good point, which is there is a lot going on in the world, but yes, we do tend to think of globalization as mostly from a state-centric approach, and I think that point you made is a really good one. As I was listening to you, as for the unipolar, multipolar, I remembered an article written by Samuel Huntington in Foreign Affairs, I think, The Lonely Superpower, in which he talks about the uni-multipolar. But then I refrain myself because that would not meet your criterion for the state-centric approach as well. So we're not going that road. But I was also, the second point that you made was this idea, this diffusion of power. I remember this really good report by the National Intelligence Council in which one of the key ideas was this, diffusion of power, and how do we deal with this? Because on the one side, you have all these sectors asking the state to act and defend them, but on the other, it's quite impossible to do this in many areas. So this idea of the diffusion of power, I think that it's also a very key point here. What I would like to hear, what I would like for you to talk a bit about is the other side, the last point that you made at the end of your presentation, which is those sectors that are discontent and frustrated with globalization. We saw this for instance, in the United States. How can a federal government or a state government, because in the US you always have these layers, deal with these sectors? Because on the one hand, there is a lot of going on, but on the other, how can you be able to defend those peoples who are your voters at the end of the day? That would be my very easy question for you. And lastly, the e-commerce and the digital economy. I think that one of the most interesting questions we have to ask, besides is globalization working for you, is also how is globalization working for the digital main companies, in the sense of aren't Facebook or Google so powerful that at the end of the day, is it healthy for the economy? Is it healthy for the linkage between state and society? How do we deal with them whilst at the same time, of course, maintaining privacy and maintaining all sorts of freedom of expression, which is, of course, one of the key issues in our current societies?
Thank you very much. But before asking you to answer her questions, I'm also going to ask some few questions. And then afterwards, we'll give also the floor to everyone here. And I will propose to obtain, well, 3 questions in the beginning, and then you can answer everyone the questions that were already made, and those questions too. And then we'll have a second round of 3 more questions, and then we close the session. So the questions I would like to raise are very simple. The first of all, and that is important, is that well, when you say that the Chinese economy and Asian economies will have in the future 50%, 55% is too much in my opinion, but 50% of the gross domestic product in 2050, for instance, they have an endogenous market, so they don't need the market of developed economies to be sustainable. But as a matter of fact, for them to arrive at this objective, they need the developed economies to increase their gross domestic product until then. Because if the developed economies are not growing until 2050, it will be also a little difficult for them to achieve this objective in 2050. So if there is stagnation in developed economies, how do you think it will be possible to have a very big increase in intermediate economies until 2050? It will be difficult. Then the second question is that these economies, we have the assumption that, well, wages are very low in these economies, and productivity is similar to the productivity in developed economies. So they are very competitive. But as a matter of fact, if we make what we call segmentation of the labor market, we arrive to the conclusion that you have restrictions in what concerns the supply of labor force. And that's the reason why wages are increasing 7 to 8% a year in some industries in China. So if that happens, how will it be possible in these sectors to have competitive advantages in the future, even considering what is happening in developed countries? That's also important to be considered. Then a third question, which is also very important, has to do with the idea that some authors have, as for instance Rostov had this theory, and all the Rostovians, that while developed economies have tendency to increase a lot, and they will always increase. And so for them, development is, well, the growth of capital and the growth of gross domestic product. This is development. Well, there is also another, well, I don't agree with these theories, obviously, because for me development is different from growth, economic growth. But there is also another theory, which is there is a certain tendency in developed economies, always a tendency for stagnation. They will not increase forever, they will have a stagnation. And that is going to generate a problem. Is it possible to say that there is a third alternative? There is an alternative to the first model, which is the keep on flying passengers. Well, they are always keeping on flying with a certain economic growth. And there is also an alternative to the prepare for landing passengers scenario. There will be stagnation, so they will have to land. And this third alternative can be growth with quality, with a certain, well, distance between the other two alternatives. Then, well, when we think about what is happening in globalization, we think that there are asymmetries and there are inequalities. And well, the market economy without any kind of intervention from state, in my opinion, modest opinion, has tendency to generate inequalities. So I think like that because I'm not a liberal. So I think that it's necessary to have some kind of intervention in the economy, in the market economy, to avoid concentration of economic power and the inequality problems in the long-term perspective. This means that when we think about globalization, we must think about some negative aspects concerning globalization, but so we must think about new global governance and good governance at the world level. So nowadays we cannot be in favor of globalization without being in favor of global governance and well, good global governance. And we should discuss about this because many people that likes to criticize globalization, they don't speak about global governance and good global governance and the democratization of international institutions and the importance of human rights in these in supranational institutions. They should also care about that. I think this is also a big problem. And finally, when we think about inequalities and about the concentration of economic power, we must also think that it is necessary eventually a new economic development model, because we criticize the economic development at the world level, but we don't present an alternative in terms of economic and in terms of model, of development model. I suppose it would be important to try to present an alternative in terms of economic development model. And maybe it's important to consider the possibility of having a model with two ways, not only one way. For a long time, when we were thinking about economic development, we're thinking about tradable sector, the tradable goods sector. It was necessary to invest in the tradable goods sector. I mean, in the transactions goods sector. Of course, this sector is very important in terms of productivity and in terms of exports. But if you want to solve the problem of unemployment, it's necessary also to have some public investment, and it's necessary also to have some investment in non-tradable goods sector. And so we must have models with two ways, not only consider the tradable goods sector, but also the non-tradable goods sector, and with a certain role of the different governments. Do you think that I'm totally wrong about this or not? And you can, first of all, answer these questions, and then we are going to ask the three questions. And we are going to ask to the people here to ask more questions.
Well, thank you very much. Actually, I come from a cultural tradition where nobody is ever totally wrong. So you can be quite confident that you're mostly right. Now, let me very quickly respond to these very penetrating questions that have been asked. One is the India-China and the characterization that India's private sector, China's state sector. I think it's true that in the Chinese case, Chinese policy has been dominated by the state, and even in the post-liberalization period, the successful, what are called private sector companies, many of them are actually very powerful. I mean, the People's Liberation Army owns many corporations in China. Good luck to them. In India, the difference is that we started off with a lot of private sector, and the dominant concern of the state was to try and control the private sector, failing to realize that you can control things, but it's very difficult to persuade people to do things. And in my view, we wasted maybe 30 years or so in a very dysfunctional, state-controlled effort which held back the private sector. I'm not in favor of, by the way, saying that we should just let them rip, but it was not, in fact, the right way of going about it. And the Chinese started reforming in 1980, and India started reforming in 1991. From 91 onwards, we did the easy thing, which is just get rid of a lot of dysfunctional state controls, and that led to some good effects. But it's very clear that, some of my business circle friends who tend to say, just get the government out of the way, I mean, that's just nonsense. At least in a country like India, the government has a huge role to play in providing infrastructure. That doesn't have to be just the government. It can be with a lot of private partnership. But if you're going to build a road through a certain area, somebody's got to acquire the land, and you can't just do it without the government. So in my view, what the government in India is doing, how well it's doing it is another matter. We're no longer interested in controlling Indian industry. They're doing whatever they're doing more or less in a free market kind of way. But government must deliver on infrastructure, and for India, government must deliver a lot on the basic social services, health, education, and increasingly a little bit of the social security. So there, I would say, if I were told that the government of India at the highest political level has decided that we're not bothered with what happens, let the private sector be governed by the market, and let us simply make sure that regulation ensures there's nobody capturing the market, so that there's no anti-competitive behavior. We're going to concentrate on infrastructure and delivery of social services. We would be in very good shape. Unfortunately, while I think when I was in government, that's what we used to say, but between saying and doing is a big gap, and that's fair. Now, you talked about democracy. You know, all Indians are proud of being a democracy. I personally always feel that we shouldn't be given that much credit because we are so diverse, we can't be anything else. So, you know, as you just mentioned yourself, Mrs. Gandhi tried very briefly, and, you know, it's just not possible. So we're a democracy for whatever it's worth, and I think we've got to learn to live with what the consequences of that are. Also, the institutions that need to support it. Now, there, I would never draw lessons for other people, but I would say that there are many institutional aspects of India's development which have strengthened the electoral democracy part. You know, if you define democracy, every 5 years the ability to get up and say, you know, you guys are making a mess of things, get the hell out, we're a democracy. Now, you know, if you talk to a lot of NGOs and others, and if you define democracy as somehow being able to make the government listen to you and do what you want, which, by the way, isn't democracy. I mean, that's the whole logic of a democratic system, is you get your chance to express your views, and you get a chance to express at the time of election what you think. And we need to make sure that the elections are clean, which is a huge job. Even in the United States, people are worried about, you know, corporate finance, et cetera, and I'm sure we are not doing nearly as good a job as we should be doing. But I think there's no question in India that political power is a contested activity. And there are more than one people, and governments change and switch around, and that's more or less what we think of as democracy. That's not doing too badly. Now, what the consequences of being a democracy are that, you know, everybody who's not doing nearly as well as they want to can make a big fuss about it. Now, for a long time, you know, we were concerned that we should make sure that there are fewer poor people. And the truth is that in the last 15 years, in India, belatedly, I mean, we should have done it 20 years earlier, but there's been a huge reduction in the number of people below a particular poverty line. But, you know, no sooner that, and it's also true, by the way, unlike, say, in the US, that the median real income in India has been rising. So it is not the case, and I can understand the unhappiness in the US, because if you say the median real income hasn't risen for 20 years, that's a pretty grim kind of situation. And when you look at Pew and all these people, they invariably say that the Indian public seems to think the future is going to be better, which is not what you hear, let's say, in similar polls in the US. But, you know, new demands come up in a democratic system which are not captured by these things. I mean, for example, yes, there's less poverty. Yes, the middle class is experiencing a rise in income. But in India, since we are a fraction, you know, we have caste divisions in the country. So quite a bit of democratic attention is paid to, well, yes, the GDP may have grown at 8%, and maybe even there are fewer people who are poor, but maybe my caste hasn't done as well as the average. So that's another constraint. Yet another issue that comes up is regional. I mean, yeah, the country's done well, but what about the state? And that can translate into politics. Of course, the big issue, gender, I mean, which is an area where we are not, at the moment, we don't think we're doing all that well. That's a new dimension, which has nothing to do, I mean, even women in well-off communities don't have as much of an access to everything that we think they should. So many dimensions to take care of and not easy to do. You know, on the issue of global governance, now, it's clear that if we, and you raise that issue, that, you know, if we're going to live in an open world, we need more global governance. Yes, and we don't actually have, I mean, I don't think the global institutions are moving in a manner which suggests that they are capable of delivering better global governance. The UN is stymied in the sense that it's not really able to take too many decisions. We have a G20, which is not representative. But you know, while it did an outstanding job immediately after the crisis of 2008, since then it has, for example, singularly failed to protect the walking back on trade, singularly failed to provide a clear set of agreements on climate change. So, I mean, there is a huge global governance deficiency, which somehow or the other we have to take into account. Now, your last point, and I want to clarify my own position on this. I'm not saying, by the way, that because the developing countries are 50% or 55% of the GDP, they don't need the industrialized countries and therefore they can hunker down themselves. What I am saying, however, is that they're a large enough group that if they remain open to each other, then I think, A, they'll be setting a good example to the industrialized countries, and there's enough of a momentum for growth in 50% of the world's GDP being open and free to trade with each other, that even if the industrialized countries slow down, I don't think that the ability of the developing countries to grow will be that much affected. And this is a difference from, to some extent, the model that underlay George Friedman's presentation, because that was a model that said the engine that's driving world growth has, the engine that's driving world growth is broke. And if it's broke, then what on earth are the developing countries going to do? So what I'm saying is that it's quite possible that the industrialized world may slow down because it's not able to fix its own internal problems and may in fact be erecting barriers. But many of these developing countries now together constitute a big enough market, have the supply capabilities, and most important, they have a huge gap between their level of productivity and the existing frontier levels. Now, for the industrialized countries to grow rapidly, the frontier has to expand. For us to increase productivity, the frontier doesn't have to expand. For the next 15 years, we can take advantage of all the productivity possibilities that already exist and which are not being utilized. Actually, what this means is that if the industrialized world doesn't move rapidly, they will just allow the developing countries to catch up with them and become a little more competitive when everybody does realize that we do need to move together. But I'm not for one moment saying that the industrialized, that we don't care, or that we shouldn't care, or that we should be protectionist vis-a-vis industrialized countries. All I'm saying is that just because the industrialized countries get trapped into a low growth phenomenon because of some policy constraints on them, the game isn't up for the developing countries. There are a lot that they can do.
All right, so I think I was asked two questions. Let me just mention them briefly. One was about just more on the situation in the United States. So if President Trump follows through on half of what he says in terms of the economic agenda, this will be the biggest change in U.S. foreign economic policy since Franklin Roosevelt signed the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act in 1934, which basically put the U.S. into the global economic system. But it's unclear how far this agenda will progress, but I think one has to keep it in mind. And he's responding to his base. And you know, the numbers, the U.S. is now in an 8-year economic growth phase. And so many people say, well, what's the problem? But those numbers, you know, disguise the reality, as you said, that for many Americans, that hasn't been reflected in their paychecks. And this inequality that is really widened in the United States is what's driving a lot of this. And a lot of it is exploited by political parties, and I don't think there's an understanding of the churn of the economy. We always talk about offshore jobs, but there are onshore jobs, and you lose jobs, you create jobs. Somebody in Massachusetts lose their job, it's more likely they lost it to somebody in Georgia, the state of Georgia, or Tennessee, than somebody in China. I mean, that's just what really happens. It's the churn within the American economy that's the real dynamic, not the global piece of that, because the U.S. is such a huge market unto it itself. But if you have to think about, the kind of solutions you would think about, the challenge we have in the United States is we don't match our education system to our economy. We have a whole track, wonderful colleges, universities, and everything. There's a stigma if you don't do that you go to vocational school or something. And it prevents a lot of people from, and the community college system we have in the United States, which is a fabulous resource if we would actually use it in the way that was tied to the economy, to prepare people for the reality that for their working lives, if they're 20 or so, they're probably going to have 10 to 12 jobs. They're not training for a job or a profession. They're training to be agile, learn quickly, adapt, shift. That's the best skills you could have in the kind of economy we're looking at today. And if you can have an education system that links to what the needs of that economy will be, that would be really good. You see examples of that in parts of Europe, which I think would be interesting. And because of you mentioned our federal system, this is not something the U.S. federal government, Washington, actually has any business dealing with. We have 50 U.S. states. This is a role for governors in the states. Our education system is at a state level or even local level. So you do see, if you look closely, a number of really interesting experiments in some U.S. states where they are doing this. And that's where the real laboratory is happening, and that's where the jobs are, after all. So it's not totally pessimistic. I think one can look at areas like that. But the president has, gained support because of a basic kind of feeling among his supporters that the United States, which you could say the creator of the post-war system, Americans are the losers of that system. And that's not shared everywhere in the United States, but it's shared among a certain core that elected this president. And so it goes beyond sort of the foreign economic policy dynamics. And you see that in his broader approach to the world. America first would be a lonely superpower in the end, because being first means being very lonely, because you're unilateral, you're just doing your own thing. But I think for our colleagues, our allies, others who have to look at this, again, in the media, the fixation seems to be on the burden sharing demands he is imposing on NATO allies, for instance, to pay more in defense and share the burdens. I would suggest it's really good to look at a different thing he's saying, which is burden shedding. The United States is not only asking others to share the burdens, it's getting out. It's leaving. It's not going to do things it did before under this president. Democracy promotion, human rights, these kinds of things, leaving the field. The idea that the United States is going to engage in the Middle East and try to figure out all of those issues, not going to happen. He's leaving it to you. And so burden shedding is much more going to have an impact on Europe, I think, than the burden sharing debate, which is what everybody seems to be talking about. The other question was about the technology companies. My quick analogy is, when they first invented the automobile, somehow a car suddenly showed up on some dirt road where everyone was riding horses or walking down the path. And suddenly here comes this machine that's going faster. People are getting there, easier. It's revolutionizing everything. But there were no rules. This thing just appeared and took off, right? There were no rules for the auto industry when it was first created. People didn't know what to do with it. There were no, they were sideboards. You stood on the side of the car. There were no seat belts. There were no speed limits. There weren't even stop signs. There was nothing. And, after a while, we figured out, we might want to fix this. I think we're at a similar stage with a much more rapid development with the technology that we're creating. There were no rules when Apple started and all these companies started. Now we're saying, they were the darlings of the media, darlings of politicians, they were the job creators. Now we're saying, hey, wait a minute, let's figure this out. And so I think that's the phase we're in right now. And if you take this to my point, we're only dealing with the current issues. The ones that are coming are going to be harder for us. If I talk about the biocognitive age, we're talking about facial technology, facial recognition technology in the hands of China. They can track every individual. They know what's going on. That's very different. Even in our communities, police departments having facial recognition technology, that's a big debate in the United States. So the potential for this related to democracy is quite huge. But take it even further. Talk about globalization. Has these phases. There's a book by Richard Baldwin. If you haven't read it, it's worth reading. He says, a big phase of globalization was knock down all the barriers to goods flows. That was a big phase of globalization. Then there was a whole phase where we could start to erase the barriers to services. And that's part of the digital thing that's going on. But increasingly, we're reducing the barriers to people. And that really creates turmoil. And if you link that to this bio-revolution, where it's not only a migrant coming across the ocean, but a holographic presence of someone from India working with you, sitting right here. That's the future we're talking about. So we have to think really hard about this because we're not ready for that. And what's the company that created that? Because that's the value that will be created. So it's not about artificial intelligence, it's about remote intelligence. It's about synthetic biology. It's about telepresence, as I mentioned, telerobotics. These are the industries that are coming our way. Some of them are already starting. And so we're grappling, in Silicon Valley, they talk about the difference between Silicon Valley and Washington, which is, in Silicon Valley, it's the speed of light. And in Washington, it's the speed of law. And there's a big gap between the two of those.
Thank you very much. Now we are going to accept 3 questions. Each person that wants to ask a question should identify herself and can ask the question in maximum in 1 minute. You are the first.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Rebelo Sousa, Chairman. I am Fernando Taborda, as I said in morning, and I am retired of Millennium BCP Group. And I would like to do to all panel and sirs and madam 2 quickly questions. Do you think global democratic elect government is positive? And the second, do you believe in future global democratic elected government? I go give my opinion, is obligatory. I believe and I wait for it anxiously to the well of the mankind and is survivably. Thank you, sirs.
Well, thank you very much. Second question. Over there.
It's a question for our Indian friend. I was very interested in what you said about autonomous growth from emerging countries that could, in some sense, save the 20th century mass production for mass consumption model with big emerging market consumers. But you also said that you have an environmental wall on that. But I would add another wall, which is vested interests. Because this model of the 20th century, to really grow in an autonomous way, needs a lot of mass consumption means a lot of freedom of choice, freedom of ideas, competition in production. If you don't have that, it's difficult. But all this threatens a lot of vested interest in these in emerging countries. I'm Brazilian. I know what I'm talking about. You're Indian. You know also what I'm talking about. It's the Chinese conundrum, which is you ask the Chinese, they say, we want to have a big internal market that can be an alternative to the Europeans and Americans that consume with credit, etc. But if you need to liberalize credit, if you liberalize credit, it's the end of the Communist Party. So they don't do it. They do one step on and one step backwards. So maybe what's happening, and I'm going to the end, is in industrialized countries, as Dan has said, maybe there is an expansion now. And maybe we are getting a new way to produce and consume that is not mass production for mass consumption, and a way that will need much less the rest of the world. So maybe the decoupling.
Can you end your question? Can you end your question,
this is
please?
The question. The decoupling will come from the industrialized countries and not from the emerging ones.
Third question, please. Who wants to ask a third question? Professora Laborinho.
Thank you. If there's any other question, I'm the head of the office of Ibero-American organization here in Lisbon. And you talk about China, you talk about this, the question is to Mr. Hamilton, you talk about Atlantic, you talk about Asia, and I would like to know, exactly because they are in the middle of Pacific and Atlantic, between Europe and Asia, how do you think is the role of Latin America, that have also Brazil, how do you think is the role of Latin America, considering they are more and more middle-income countries with a growing nowadays?
Well, now, can you answer to the questions?
Well, let me try. Well, on the first question, do you think a global election is possible? By which you mean people in different countries voting for, the short answer is no. Maybe regrettable, but I don't think there's any chance of it. In the future of mankind, anything is possible. No. You see, I never put a limit on mankind's ability to reach new heights. But not only not in my lifetime, probably not even in my kids' lifetime. I think we're just too far. I mean, the truth is, if the European Union cannot actually vote for a European government, the chance of the rest of mankind voting for a global government, I think we're looking to you to set an example. If you do that, you may find a lot of traction.
I believe as many men in this planet, that in the future there are one great humanity revolution. And the world revolution is not revolution with the guns, is re-evolution, two-line evolution.
Eu lamento, mas não seria conveniente que houvesse este tipo de diálogo. Ora bem, vamos deixar o nosso orador falar.
See, on the other question, I sense again some discomfort with my saying that, look, if the industrialized world decides not to be open, we in the developing countries can still maintain a high growth. Now, I repeat, I think that we can. You made one point, and that is that, among many, but you made one important point, that you need competition. Absolutely correct. I mean, I think the developing countries' capability of growing is going to be a function of themselves following the kind of pro-competition, pro-market, open, etc., policies. If they all hunker down into a country-based protectionism, we're dead in the water. But if 50% of the world's GDP says that, look, you guys have given up on global trade, but we haven't, then I think that group will do quite well. Now, as far as competition is concerned, this lot should be freely welcome investment from industrialized countries. I mean, my guess is that if the industrialized countries follow bad policies and the developing countries follow good policies and half the GDP is here, most of the invention and technology and management of global investment companies will move to the second category. And they should be, in my view, we should encourage that. So I'm not making a sort of exclusionist, we don't need you, we can do it kind of argument at all. I'm saying we're big enough now, and we have enough resources, and we now have the capacity to catch up. But earlier, frankly, we didn't. So we should follow sensible policies, open up, integrate, India opening up, China opening up, East Asia opening up. And you know, if Volkswagen and other European car companies want to come and manufacture electric vehicles here, they should be welcome to do so. So I think it's in that framework that I'm saying that the picture portrayed this morning by Professor Friedman, that there is one model, and that model is broke. And if the industrialized countries can't fix that model, there's no hope for anyone. I don't agree with that view.
Professor Daniel Hamilton, do you want to answer to the questions?
Well, there is a question here, Latin America, and just on the democratic revolution of 2,000 years, I'm with you. Hope that, yeah. But in the meantime, it was also, I didn't mention your global governance question. We're just not in that moment, I think, as you said. We are in a moment now of preserving, hopefully protecting that which we have achieved, rather than taking another big leap forward, because the institutions we have currently are all under threat or are fracturing. So I think the energy, political energy, really has to be on making sure this whole thing doesn't crack open, rather than have more ambitious next tier plans, because we're just not in the political moment for that, unfortunately. Latin America, different ways to think about it. There's a lot of media, again, about China investing in South America, for instance. If you actually do a study of it, you see, of course, the #1 Asian investor in all of South America is Japan. And the next is Korea, and then China. And a lot of Chinese announcements about big projects don't materialize in the end. There was a report by the Brazilian-China Chamber of Commerce that looked at all the announcements, and most of them didn't ever happen. So one always has to be beware of the media branding here and what really happens. I think Brazil, over time, if it's just my personal view, if you look at the way the trade flows with China, it is becoming a colonial relationship. You know, Brazil is exporting agricultural goods, China's sending them manufacturing. It's a very unbalanced relationship. Actually, the US-Brazilian commercial relationship is much better balanced, and so is the EU-Brazilian one. And if you look about the dynamics within the Atlantic, again, as I said, investment is the driver of commerce in the Atlantic basin, not trade. Trade follows investment. So one has to look where companies want to go. They usually want to be in the market rather than send stuff to a market. And this is a challenge for a number of countries in South America, particularly Brazil, about the difficulty of investing. Some other countries have changed. Colombia, you know, has now multinational companies that are global. They're looking to invest here. In other places. So it's not sort of a one-way street anymore. I think the other thing that's interesting in sort of my Atlantic sort of focus is the relevance of experiments in South America with economic reforms, energy, other kinds of reforms to Africa. it's not that the West has a lot to offer people in Africa as much as maybe others who are rising economies that have had to go through similar challenges. I was with some Africans because they have such problems with energy access. And they took a tour to Central America, where there's a Central America energy pool that's been set up. They found that the most relevant thing they'd ever seen. And it was directly relevant to them, much better than a lot of Westerners coming and tell how to set up an energy network. So I think there are these connections. My point about globalization is that these connections are happening today. They're kind of below the radar screen, but maybe they're more relevant to people than some of the big topics we tend to talk about.
Well, thank you very much. I think that we don't need more questions because everybody has already understood the message of our guests of honor. And so I think to end our conference that we must thank our two guests for the very good, very bright interventions they made. We want to thank Montek Ahluwalia and also Daniel Hamilton and Raquel Pinto also. And so I ask you for your applause, Portuguese style, if it is possible, for some time, if it is possible.